Development here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And like most people working from home or from the office, we can hear outside some ambulances going by, but nonetheless, we're here today to talk about digital authoritarianism. You've probably tuned in because you're curious about it or you actually know the term. People in capitals like Washington, D.C. are pretty familiar with it. And in capitals around the world, they're familiar with it either because they themselves are using it or because they are guarding against it. And yet, despite the fact that a lot of people know about it, policymakers, the private sector, tech companies, it seems to be a growing challenge. So with some financial support from Facebook, CSIS, my colleague Sam Brannon and I, who I'll turn it over to in a second, we convened a group of experts several times to try to get our head around these challenges and then try to figure out what we can do differently. So as we see it, digital authoritarianism presents four overlapping challenges. The first is that it's expanding within authoritarian-led states. So it's consolidating power in places like China and Russia and Iran and other places. Second, it's expanding the reach of authoritarians abroad, outside their own borders, to disrupt, to surveil, and more. Third, those digital authoritarian tools are being exported to like-minded regimes, either for economic gain or for its disruptive potential. And lastly, fourth, digital authoritarian tools, techniques, and strategies are being adopted within democratic countries themselves. And I'm sure that our distinguished panel will talk much more about all four of those things. So we set about to think about what can we do differently. And it's at this point that I want to mention that on the site where you registered shortly, there will be a policy brief that Sam Brannon and I have co-authored on a lot of the issues that we are going to be talking about today. So I highly encourage you to do that. There's a really great video that our friend and colleague Paul Franz produced as well that kind of summarizes the issue. But out of our convenings and learning from many other experts, including those on the panel here today, we came up with four big ideas. Apparently it's the day of four. So first and foremost, promote resilience at home. It's hard for the US to talk about US leadership abroad on digital authoritarianism without making sure that we recommit to democracy and human rights at home. Second, promote democratic and human rights principles over a free and secure internet. And the policy brief talks about how there are efforts to fragment the internet that are really troubling. Third, we need to counter digital authoritarianism. This tends to be the only focus. And it needs to be a reinvigorated focus, but it can't be the only thing that we do. We have to, go beyond tactics to create affirmative visions, norms, and principles. We believe that countries should not be forced to decide between no growth and stability or growth and stability that comes with authoritarian strings attached. So before I turn it over to Sam and our distinguished panel, I want to acknowledge Sundar Ramanujam is a research associate with our team here at CSIS, and he was really critical to producing and really leading the research. And so we wouldn't have been able to do this without him. So thanks to him. My friend and colleague, Sam Brannon, is the director of the CSIS Risk and Foresight Group, and he is also a senior fellow with the what I think is CSIS's flagship international security program. So Sam, without further ado, thanks for your collaboration on this, and over to you to introduce and moderate the panel.
Errol, thanks so much for your collaboration as well. I think Errol and I both committed the cardinal sin on this project, which is the sign of all good projects, which is that we put way too much time into it, and we convened way too many brilliant people to capture their insights. But we must have done something right with the panel that we were able to bring together this afternoon. So I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. None of them need introduction, likely to many of you on the call. But let me welcome and thank them all for joining. First, Dan Twining, who is the president of the International Republican Institute, where he leads the Institute's mission to advance democracy and freedom around the world, and really looks at this issue from a bottom-up way, and he'll address that in his remarks. He's previously served in government with the State Department's policy planning staff, in the Senate as a policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and on the staff of the U.S. Trade Representative. Suzanne Spalding, my colleague in the International Security Program, is our senior advisor for Homeland Security, and she's also the director of the Defending Democratic Institutions project at CSIS, which has done some really groundbreaking and important work on not only understanding what U.S. adversaries are up to in the use of digital authoritarianism, but what it takes from a U.S. civil society standpoint to protect ourselves and navigate the current difficulties. She's also served as a member recently of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, so looking closely at issues including election security, and she's previously the undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security. And that's just a quick glimpse at her bio, which you can find online in full. Danny Russell is vice president for the International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And of course, as a career member of the Senior Foreign Service at the U.S. Department of State, his last posting was as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, prior to which he served as the Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Asian Affairs. So Danny will help us today thinking about the connection between our approach to digital authoritarianism at home and our ambitions for Asia strategy in this century abroad. Dan, let me turn it over to you. Look forward to your comments from your vantage point at IRI on the issue.
Thanks very much, Sam, and congratulations to you and Errol for the excellent paper, which I highly recommend to everyone, having gotten a secret advanced transcript of it. Thank you. This is really, I think, the most important, yet under-discussed and underappreciated issue, frankly, in the democracy space. We have seen a period over the past decade or so in which democratic norms and principles that were established in the pre-internet age, in the pre-digital age, have been subverted quite systematically and strategically by authoritarians. Authoritarians in many ways have out-innovated the democracies. They have not out-innovated tech companies based in the democracies. They have out-innovated democratic societies and democratic governments in understanding that cyberspace, the digital space, is a central arena in the competition between a free and open world and one that looks more like the world envisaged, for instance, by the Chinese Communist Party, which I'm happy to say has sanctioned me personally and wants to control speech, not just in China, but around the world. And democracy should not stand for that. So a couple points. One is that there is a top-down phenomenon of autocrats deploying the suite of technology instruments to surveil and control and weaken their internal opposition to make sure that citizens cannot organize effectively inside autocracies. There's a top-down effort by great power authoritarians in China and Russia to project digital illiberalism well beyond their shores through a variety of instruments that I know we'll talk more about, the digital Belt and Road from China, Russia's extraordinary campaign of disinformation. These are top-down efforts. There is, I think, at the same time, a bottom-up effort in the democracies, and this conversation is part of it, to figure out how do we protect and defend our open societies. And we cannot impose solutions the way authoritarians can. So they can flip a switch and do total surveillance. We cannot flip a democratic switch and do full spectrum civic education, defeat disinformation, etc. So there needs to be an organic effort that I know we're going to have a chance to talk more about, which reflects our open societies and our bottom-up kind of people-led approach to openness. The last thing I would say for now, because I know we'll have a chance to chat, is there are some models we can look to abroad. There are some great learnings. Countries like Taiwan and Estonia actually became democracies more in the digital age, right? As formerly, as societies that essentially opened up at the same time that the global internet was forming and taking off. They have adapted through democratic innovation, their own institutions, their own approach on these issues in ways that are quite compelling and I think offer a lot of lessons, whether it's disinformation, whether it's how do you do health surveillance in a democratic way that is not authoritarian in the context of COVID, whatever it may be, that there are some things that we could learn as Americans from other techno-democracies, if you will. And finally, I would just say, I think democracies really are going to need to work a lot more closely together on these issues in the way that we historically have worked together on all the big issues in the real world. We need to concert much more systematically in the digital space because we are all confronting the same issues around security of technology supply lines, around surveillance issues, around authoritarian forms of disinformation emanating from abroad. And none of us should have to handle these issues alone. There's a great role for American leadership, but there's also a great chance to build new coalitions, just like we created coalitions in previous geopolitically pivotal moments, to create some new coalitions around these issues, which frankly are not just foreign policy questions, they very much affect our free and open society at home. And therefore, the stakes could not be higher. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. A number of rich topics that I'm sure we will return to. Suzanne, help us understand how this is. What's the connection between digital authoritarianism and what's going on in the United States right now at really a pivotal moment in the lead up to the election?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I too got that sneak preview of your report, and it's quite impressive. And you really covered such a wide range of issues, which has been said is appropriate because this digital authoritarianism impacts almost everything that we do, certainly on an international level, and very much impacts what's happening here in the U.S. as well. And really, what I've been focused on, as you know, in the Defending Democratic Institutions project is looking at this issue of trust in our institutions. And I think one of the reasons that digital authoritarianism trends can sometimes get a bit of a foothold is because of the declining trust in democracy and in democratic institutions. And of course, they're exacerbating that trend. But that is a trend that is based on a lot of complex factors, including inequality, social and economic inequality that continues to grow. I think a lot of people equate democracy and unbridled capitalism, and I think that is in part, leads to a decline in support for the notion of democracy. But it's very, very difficult to combat the disinformation and information operations, particularly out of Russia, which is, while lots of countries are engaged in malign foreign influence, Russia is really the country that is most engaged targeting the US population with messages designed to undermine their trust and confidence in democracy and in our democratic institutions. And part of what makes this so challenging is that it goes way beyond just elections. As Christopher Wray has said, it's a 365-day-a-year threat that is targeting institutions beyond our elections. And most perniciously, I think, targeting institutions that we rely upon for information. So targeting trust and confidence in the media and targeting trust and confidence in our justice system, which is what I've spent the last almost 3 years looking at and gathering the evidence for. And again, what this disinformation information operations do is they pick up on weaknesses of our own making, and they amplify and exacerbate whether it's the flames of division that already engulf our online discourse that they pour gasoline onto, or declining trust in institutions, as I said at the outset, that was there already, but exacerbating that with messages that the system is irrevocably broken. And this is really important, and it helps us think about where do we go from here. It's exacerbated by an effort to heighten and accelerate the decline in trust in our sources of information and courts, which we look to as arbiters of truth. It is given a foothold because our institutions are flawed and do need reform, and because our mechanisms of accountability for those institutions are not well understood, are not functioning the way they should, and are themselves not trusted. Again, if you think about our courts, if you think about the media, if you think about the intelligence community, right, those places that we would look to try to get a sense of what's really happening and how to hold institutions accountable are not functioning well. If you think about what's happened to our inspectors general throughout our government, for example. So what the solutions, sort of looking toward what do we do about it, and I know we'll have a fuller conversation about this. The institutions need, obviously, to reform themselves. They need to understand this deficit of trust and work hard to earn that trust, to educate the public about accountability mechanisms. And I was pleased to see the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in his year-end report highlight disinformation and the importance of judges engaging in civic education. And that's the second big piece of it that we've been pushing, which is build public resilience against the pernicious messaging of digital authoritarians. This idea that there is no truth, right? Moving us to a post-truth world. The idea that the system is irrevocably broken. That is designed to rob us of the informed and engaged citizenry a democracy depends upon. We need to educate the public about our democratic institutions, what their role is, how individuals must hold them accountable. We need to empower individuals to be more effective agents of change, that democracy is worth fighting for, and that it must be fought for because it is under attack. And I think this notion that digital authoritarians have an advantage is one area where I think I sort of diverge from some of what you have in your report, because I do not envy them. I think they are I do believe firmly they are on the wrong side of history, and primarily because they rely on secrecy. And while they try to practice jujitsu, they think they're going to use our strengths against us. We need to rely on our strength. And one of those strengths is that a democracy depends on transparency. We are used to dealing in a more open world. We need to get better at it. We need to train to fight in the light. If you train to fight in the dark and you met your adversary at night, or you could turn off the light, you'd have the advantage. We need to learn to operate with fewer secrets so that we can go around turning on the lights all over the world. And those authoritarian regimes that are brittle, that can't change, and that rely on secrecy will be at the disadvantage if we stay true to who we are and what we do.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I definitely want to turn back to are we at a turning point toward a negative trend or a positive trend, and maybe what the factors are that you're watching and others are watching on that point to determine which way we're headed. Danny, could you help us a little bit on connecting this with the U.S. strategic priority on thinking about an Asia strategy, and particularly whether it's a Trump 2 or Biden 1 administration, where does digital authoritarianism play in our Asia strategy, and how does everything Suzanne outlined about what's going on domestically affect what we do in Asia?
Well, first of all, thanks, Sam and Errol. I thought that was a great report. Secondly, Dan and Suzanne are hard acts to follow. They were both very insightful and very articulate. Look, I mean, I think the report makes very clear that the US has to play a prominent role in helping establish or safeguard digital norms, digital rules, standards, and that has to be integrated into our approach to diplomacy and to foreign policy generally, and Asia policy specifically. The unfortunate reality is that it feels like we're actually losing ground. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific, which is one of the major battlegrounds over digital authoritarianism, the problem isn't that the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy doesn't have digital norms and standards initiatives. It does. The problem is first that those initiatives like the overall strategy live more on paper than they do in the real world. And there's enough of a gulf between the rhetoric and the reality that it hurts our credibility in the eyes of most of the region. Secondly, that those programs are just absolutely dwarfed by what China is doing in the digital space in the region. And thirdly, that to the extent that programs and initiatives like, say, the Clean Network Initiative are seen mostly in the context of an anti-China crusade, they're not going to be nearly as attractive to the countries in the region that depend so heavily on China for trade and technology. So we have to remind ourselves again and again, as Dan and Suzanne have done very well, what the goal of our policy is here. We can't get so caught up in strategic rivalry that blocking and countering Beijing at every turn becomes the end unto itself. Clearly, democratic societies need real protections, need safeguards against these cyber threats and this authoritarian technological gambit. But it really doesn't look like the right answer is going to lie in, say, decoupling, because building firewalls, purging our systems of foreign contaminants, letting the government define and curate exactly what information is granted entry. That's what we're fighting against. That's what we're objecting to. So, decoupling and a bifurcation of technologies and networks, it's not going to support the cause of developing an open internet or a set of universal principles that are adhered to widely. Instead, the goal ought to be to find ways to bring China and other actors into an international system with certain standards and rules, to create incentives, peer pressure, use leverage to get them to adhere to those standards. I admit, easier said than done. One of the other important flags in the report is actually the extent of China's push in the opposite direction. China's push to secure greater influence over global technological standards and rules, not just through the spread of Huawei and Beidou and other products and systems, but by dint of its activism in international organizations. It's really, really consequential. So I think another urgent task for the United States is to abandon this kind of isolationist contempt for multilateralism and get back into the diplomatic game in a big way. I mean, we've urgently got to show leadership in existing institutions. We've got to help, as Dan was saying, organize multilateral coalitions, pull together governments, private sector, civil society as well. And I don't think you can overstate the need for a collaborative strategy among like-minded states. There's so much more that we can do to elevate international cooperation on digital norms and rules. There's a crying need to partner with a range of like-minded countries like Japan, like Australia, who are obvious and natural partners, but also bringing India along, I think, is extremely important. There are some real concerns with the Indian government's use of digital techniques for security and informational control, but that underscores why it's so important for democracies to figure out how we can make common cause. I'd add also that, beyond the erosion of rules that China's undertaking is the fact that they are establishing really significant facts on the ground through the Belt and Road, through the digital Silk Road and the space information corridor stuff. And of course, through the export of digital surveillance and tools, as you described in your report. Some of this is built on the opportunistic success in meeting the world's, especially the developing world's, hunger for infrastructure, including digital infrastructure. And so it points to another key principle, which is you can't beat something with nothing. There's a big role for the US government in encouraging and facilitating US tech companies to engage and access emerging markets. But lastly, and I know I'm going long, is the critical point that Suzanne made, which is the erosion of American credibility and moral authority in the eyes of the international community. Look, when we are credible as an exemplar, as a model of behavior, not only does it inspire and attract citizens in other countries to push to emulate that, but it also serves as a crucial proof point that the open, democratic, rules-based system actually works. And frighteningly, the opposite example is unfortunately even more powerful, that we discredit our argument when we generate so much evidence that our system is dysfunctional. And it gives autocrats everywhere a very persuasive tool, a very easy way out. So again, easier said than done, but I think ultimately the critical factor here is that we have to get our act together at home, not just technologically, but politically, socially, and economically.
Thank you, Danny. And from just the opening comments there, I have three big positive agenda items that I think you highlighted. Learning from cyber democracies, learning from others who are doing better in this age of digital authoritarianism than we are from Dan. The idea from Suzanne, again, about building resilience at home, that there's a big home game dimension to be played here that is not about geopolitics. It's about domestic institutions and about what we can do already here. And then from Danny, the low-hanging fruit, frankly, of working multilaterally and keeping an open tech system where we help write the rules, which goes back to Suzanne's fight in the light sense. Let me ask you though, and I'll go to Dan and go back through the panel. Are we at a dangerous tipping point, as Errol and I do suppose in the report, where time is not on our side any longer, where there is sort of an acceleration of digital authoritarianism? As Danny said, facts on the ground are being established by China and securing the next generation networks, or we're losing trust and confidence of allies and partners in certain regions. Is the clock ticking, or do we have some time? And what do we do first? Where is there bipartisan consensus on something we can do first? Dan, can I turn to you with that one?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully this panel is indicative of quite a large degree of bipartisan consensus that we need to protect our democracy, we need to protect our people, we need to protect what we stand for in the world, and not let competitors who disdain free and open values build a different kind of world premised on entirely different digital norms than those that are free and open. So look, I think there are big things happening in the world. And I think one thing just to make clear is that they can be happening at the same time and be pulling in different directions. So technological authoritarianism feels like it's on the march. It's playing offense. At the same time, people power is on the march all over the world, from Thailand to Venezuela, from Siberia to Belarus, right? You see people standing up and not wanting to live under corrupt and closed systems, not wanting to live under elites that are not accountable to them, that varyingly want to surveil them, repress them, steal public funds from them that should go towards the public good. So it's not as if, I like Suzanne's point, it's not as if sort of the tech authoritarians have a world majority walking with them. In fact, I think most people in the world don't want to live under forms of extreme digital control. Most people in the world want to be free to speak, to organize, to vote, to have leaders who are accountable to them, etc. So the challenge for us then is, how do we turn that into leverage and progress in the digital domain? One important point, just because we work with great democracy partners all over the world in open and more complicated environments, is that it's a lot easier these days to actually organize a street protest digitally. It's a lot easier to have a leaderless protest movement. And we have seen how much impact these can have, right? From Armenia to Sudan to Hong Kong. At the same time, to turn that into actual democratic progress and democratic momentum, you need organized civic groups, you need political parties and democratic political leadership that you can only take digital democracy so far as an unorganized mass of people motivated, activated by social media, before you need to turn that into real political outcomes. And real political outcomes require organization and mass consent and sort of institutionalization. So that's just a point that actually the civic networks of the kind that so many democracies enjoy, we need to replicate those in the undemocratic countries in order for the digital success to flourish. I don't want to go on except to also just point out that Suzanne's point is spot on. Authoritarians are afraid. They are going on offense technologically and doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on surveillance and digital control at home, because they know that if they did not exercise those forms of digital censorship and digital unfreedom, their people would probably want to live under different leaders and under different forms of government than those that are at large in China and Russia, for instance. So we should not doubt that technology at the end of the day is something that authoritarians use and manipulate, but that in fact, they are employing these forms of control fundamentally through reasons of fear. And that should give us some confidence.
Thanks, Dan. And Suzanne, let me pick up with the question of optimism. So, I think there are troubling signs of the spread of digital authoritarianism within mature democracies, the United States being a principal example. But you are still optimistic about where we're headed in this, and why should Errol and I maybe sleep a little better tonight?
Yeah, listen, I love the fact that you all really emphasize the need for a strategic approach, right? There's a lot of tactical things going on to address pieces of the concerns that you raised with regard to digital authoritarianism, but we need to, and that strategic approach, I think, requires us to have that long-term vision for where we can go and why we want to go there. But that's not to say, and that's where I think ultimately I am optimistic. It's not to say that we don't have very urgent requirements right now, and that we aren't, as you say, in many places around the world and in this country as well, on the precipice, right? And so, what happens in the next 22 days, and God forbid, in the months that follow up until January 20th, will make a huge difference in our ability to, where we go as we sort of are on this precipice. And things like the, cyber threats. And again, I think the points that were made about multilateral collaboration and needing to bring like-minded folks together is something that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission in its report definitely emphasized, and the need for us to be much more present at international conversations, particularly around standard setting, et cetera. And so we talk about reinvigorating the State Department's role there because, those can't be shoved off to the side, critically important things. I think on the discussion about protests, and, we know that Putin worries about the protest potential of the population. In fact, they talk about that as a tool, themselves tapping into the protest potential of the population. I think picking up on Daniel's point, one of the things we need to think about in this strategic approach as we develop this strategy is focusing on the areas around the world where we are competing with those digital authoritarians, particularly China, for influence, right? And so we've talked about that. But the point was made that China is selling a model where they promise control of your population and economic growth. It's one thing to have a population within those countries around the world where we're competing for influence that doesn't want to live under authoritarianism. It's another thing to convince leaders that are maybe, making decisions about how far down that road of authoritarianism they want to go, that we offer, that liberal democracy does offer a pathway to innovation, to growth, and to an environment in which that is not dominated by civil unrest. And this is why I say, and the point has been made, that if we don't figure this out here in this country really quickly, again, our ability to have that influence around the world to tilt that trend will be significantly impeded. So whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic depends a lot on what happens, frankly, in this election. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Suzanne. And for those who are watching online, if you haven't already, you can submit questions. We're going to turn it over to audience Q&A in a second, but I wanted to turn to Danny first. Danny, your thoughts on sort of time urgency, time frame, and first actions if we were to take one?
I think there's great urgency, but in crisis, the most important thing you can do is to take a step back, take a deep breath, and look at the big picture and not just plunge in. So I think that just as we need to recognize, or just we need to say, take a strategic perspective in how we approach this problem set, we also need to recognize that we're facing an integrated strategic threat in many ways. Some of it is organized, like the Chinese digital Silk Road, that is very quickly converting large chunks of the world to Beijing-based standards and systems, and setting in motion a trajectory, a delta that's going to continue to grow, that reduces not only digital freedoms and internet access, but also reduces the ability of American systems and American companies to flourish and to penetrate. Some of it is very opportunistic. When one-party systems and strongman type leaders are taking advantage of some of the aspects of these digital tools for the purpose of repression. We're seeing Big Brother harness big data, and it better worry us. And we need to do more than just denounce it. I totally agree, passionately agree. And I feel like my career as a diplomat has provided abundant evidence of what Dan pointed to, which is a powerful human hunger for freedom, for information, for opportunity. But let's face it, never before in history have autocrats had the type of technological tools at their disposal that they have now to use for control. So on top of that, to Suzanne's point, like, this is a moment when we have a very powerful moral and political argument that we need to make. But the biggest handicap we face is American credibility. There's the whole universe of Donald Trump. I'm not going to go political. But let's also not forget that one of the greatest enablers of digital authoritarianism, in my experience, talking to Asians, is Edward Snowden. The perception that US technology had been a tool for American espionage, it's riddled with backdoors and so on. That perception has created a moral equivalence trap, a kind of whataboutism syndrome that that drains a lot of the outrage out of the view in many countries about what China is doing. I've heard that consistently from partners in the region. Another trend, as we talked about, is the hope that somehow decoupling can safeguard us. But it's by no means a given that the United States would come out ahead in a battle between two technological blocks in a decoupled world. Even our close Indo-Pacific partners are very heavily dependent on China economically. They're very wary of directly challenging Beijing. And when countries start getting forced into making choices, they're not necessarily going to be guided by old loyalties or by idealism or even by their citizens, much as they long for freedom and transparency. So, the U.S. can inflict a lot of short-term pain on China by denying advanced chips. We can talk until we're blue in the face about the threat, but cleaning up our own act, partnering with others, putting things on the table that have practical value, that are in line with the goals of the citizens in the developing world, and serving as an exemplar that shows that an open democratic society with digital freedoms flourishes, works better. These are our urgent tasks.
Thanks. And we do have an audience question that relates to things that you've already covered, but just diving in a little bit deeper here. The question Elena asks is, China has made forays into multilateral fora, including UN agencies like the International Telecommunication Union. How can we preserve the ability of such organizations such that they can help in limiting the spread of digital authoritarianism?
I think it's basically, eat your vegetables, drink plenty of water, and get a good night's sleep. It's common sense. What the Chinese are doing very, very successfully is fielding large, well-prepared, and well-coordinated delegations to these international forums. What the Chinese are doing very well is showing up at senior levels, funding the agencies and institutions, and promoting Chinese nationals in critical secretariat positions. What the Chinese are doing are bringing proposal after proposal after proposal that are not just sort of the random brainstorms of different groups or scientists or companies, but are part of their systematic approach to set and rewrite rules. And what the Chinese are doing is accelerating and fostering access by their tech companies like Huawei, ZTE, Alipay, and so on, including and particularly in the developing world, to try to establish standards and norms through products and through commercial systems. None of that is rocket science. Those are all things that we could do if we wanted to, and that we frankly ought to do, and I think that would be welcomed. And to beat this drum again, if not just as an America First initiative, but as a concerted effort among democracies, among like-minded countries, we made this sort of push, we would be more than a match for China in international fora.
Thank you. And this is a question that I'll throw to Dan and Suzanne, whoever wants to respond first. Given the existential threat posed, it's asked by Robert, given the existential threat posed by digital authoritarianism, not just abroad, but also here at home, how can Congress respond in a way that's bipartisan and has lasting effect? So what is on the potential congressional agenda here that could help? And Dan and Suzanne, who'd like to take a first cut at that? Dan.
I nominate Suzanne.
Suzanne, any objection to taking a cut at that?
Did you just throw that to me, that impossible question? Listen, I think again, I don't want to either make this too political, and certainly, at CSIS we work very hard to be nonpartisan. I do think it will be interesting to see what message the American public sends to Congress with this upcoming election. So you know, that may impact in one direction or another Congress's willingness to operate on a slightly more bipartisan basis. I don't hold out a lot of hope that we're going to suddenly see bipartisanship break out. But I do think we can take some lessons from, for example, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which managed to take a bipartisan approach to its investigation into the issues around Russian interference in our elections. So I think that it can be done. I think, you know, we are likely to have a Congress that is in a position to look back and find ways to strengthen accountability and oversight mechanisms going forward. And I think that's an important role that Congress can play. I hope that even if we wind up with Congress and the White House all in the same, you know, hands of the same party, that Congress will nevertheless rediscover its important role as a separate branch of government that is an integral part of its oversight, not just its legislative responsibility, but that its oversight is an essential part of sustaining public trust in government. And so it's not just about whether you're going to attack an administration of your own party, but whether you can sustain public trust in the accountability mechanism and checks and balances that you represent. So I'd like to see that from Congress, regardless of what happens in the election.
Yeah, I just have a comment about the tools. You know, Congress played a decisive role during the Cold War, and I'm upfront acknowledging that we're in a very different moment here, but Congress played a decisive role, really investing in the toolkit of soft power forms of American democratic influence in the world, from Fulbright scholarships to the Peace Corps to the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, it does feel to me like a kind of a present at the creation moment in the digital domain, when it would be appropriate for Congress to again lead in making some strategic investments in this global conflict with digital authoritarianism. Again, I'm not even sure necessarily that is sort of simply for the foreign operations budget, because so much of this redounds back home to how we protect our free and open system, our democracy. But you know, there are a couple innovative instruments that have been spun out just in the last few years here. One is the Development Finance Corporation, which is meant to inject a smarter US approach to development finance that feels to me like this should be a bigger part of their agenda beyond simply building roads and bridges and through financial instruments. The Open Technology Fund was spun off from Radio Free Asia. It's tiny. It has, I think, a $13 million budget. I mean, by contrast, the Peace Corps has a $400 million budget. Why not invest more in the Open Technology Fund, which does some of the very workmanlike activity that you're familiar with of supplying secure and effective digital tools to small d Democrats abroad, often in very closed spaces where they have otherwise no internet security, no ability to organize and speak online. Why not think in a 21st century way about the landscape out there and what we need to do to protect and sustain democracy? And what are the specific forms of assistance that our partners around the world require? Because actually a lot of those do come very quickly back to the digital toolkit and how they can organize and operate effectively under very tough conditions.
And Sam, I should note another bright spot is cybersecurity, which has largely been approached on a bipartisan basis in Congress. And we certainly have seen that with respect to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendations and the work of that commission, frankly. So.
Thank you. And let me ask one other final question, if I may. And that is about, we've talked about the role of the private sector. We've said that U.S. private sector has, truly been out innovating authoritarians. It's not the other way around. But often they're at the center of this conversation, and it's questions about regulation, questions about how they play in the midst of things as they write their own rules and write the rules for the rest of us in some ways in real time, as we're seeing now in the presidential contest. And I think Errol and I have a view in our report that the relationship is still pretty immature between the public and private sectors on these issues. There might be some alignment of values or at least shared interests in continuing to promote an open and free internet, but there's often a very adversarial relationship, both across borders and then even within the country. Maybe that's healthy. Maybe that's part of a good functioning democracy too. Some tension. That doesn't mean you have to cooperate perfectly. But what is, and let's address it to the U.S. tech sector in particular here. What should the conversation be about the role for the U.S. tech sector and the role of government in working with the tech sector or regulating them to a greater degree than they are already as we tackle the challenge? I don't think we've spoken directly to that. Would just be interested if you have strong views or views you're willing to share on that issue. Danny, I see you nodding most vigorously, so I'll go to you via Zoom body language on this one.
Well, I'll basically echo your point, Sam. I think that the interests of the United States suffer grievously when the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. becomes too adversarial, and it is largely adversarial. Maybe leavened with a fair degree of lack of communication or a tendency to talk past one another. This is, not to be trite and call it a Sputnik moment, but it's certainly a juncture where it is incumbent both on policymakers and on private industry to try to see if we can't come to a common definition of the challenges that we need to work against. And your report lays out many of these really important challenges that affect our economy, our society, our governance system. And so it's not simply a division of responsibilities or labor. There has to be some degree of real collaboration against the backdrop of, as you point out, a certain degree of natural tension between the regulators and the regulated. For example, we talked about international rule-setting institutions and organizations. China has a very government-led, top-down, prescriptive approach there, and is deliberately manipulating the evolution of standards as part of a strategy to gain control and be able to exploit U.S. technology and in other areas leapfrog it. The United States allows the free market to take the lead in developing standards by and large. And it's not that the US should replicate a Chinese approach, but we have to outsmart it and outcompete it. And that takes real dialogue and real collaboration between its sectors.
Suzanne, Dan, any final thoughts on that subject or anything else you'd like to say before I kick it back to Errol?
So I would just say great points, and I think the private sector finds itself in a kind of a unique situation. Certainly, Silicon Valley and the tech folks that are part of this digital authoritarianism, because they would like to say that we're not involved in government, we're not involved in politics, we're not involved in those issues. We just sell products, and we don't want to undermine our markets. And I think they are waking up to the reality, which is that that they are, the things that they are enabling and that they cannot just, take a hands-off approach. That they have to take some responsibility, and that at the end of the day, they're going to have to make some hard decisions.
Thanks.
My
And
final
Dan,
thought, Sam.
final word to you for sure.
Yeah, it goes beyond the scope of this conversation, but there's a lot of energy in Congress and beyond right now in regulating our big tech companies, which may be appropriate in a domestic context. I would just pose the question, lay out the thought that in fact there are also international implications about cutting American tech giants down to size. And what does that do for China's digital reach? I mean, if China doesn't cut its tech giants down to size, Europe has not produced the same kind of global epic changing tech companies through its much heavier form of regulation. So as we think about regulation in the tech center, I think we should be thinking about the global geostrategic stage and not simply what's happening here at home. Thank you.
Thanks. And on behalf of Errol and myself and CSIS, for those outside of the CSIS organization, thank you so much for your thought leadership on this topic and for helping us unpack it and understand it. We're already we need to write a version 2.0 of the brief just based on some of these great insights and really prescriptive ideas on policy that you've given us this afternoon. But obviously an important time, an important topic, and we look forward to following all of your writing and work. Thanks again for joining us online this afternoon. For those of you watching, the report is posted along with a video inspired by the Apple 1984 ad, so you're not going to want to miss the video that goes along with it as well. But thanks again, and thanks to CJ and his team for helping produce this online once again. Thank you.